Hello, my name is Leslie Luces Saavedra, and my project with Dr. Katie Johnston Goodstar is incorporating culturally responsive pedagogy and Indigenous ways of knowing into Minnesota K-12 education through Science Educator professional development. In 2019, Minnesota adopted new science ed standards requiring science educators teaching grades 1 through 12 to integrate Indigenous knowledge into their curriculum. Historically, the education system has been weaponized in order to inflict harm onto marginalized communities. For example, in the 1800s, boarding schools were created to impose Eurocentric and white narratives onto Indigenous children by forcibly separating them from their families and their culture. Minnesota was no exception to these sites of colonization as boarding schools began to be opened here in the late 1880s. Presently, the harm caused by the Eurocentric education system continues to carry on for Native students. In one study, Native youth identified 4 areas where they experience push-out from schools. These are curricular harm, disproportionate discipline, schooling being designed to dispossess, and racism, implicit and explicit, along with microaggressions. In a study exploring how Indigenous people show up in history curriculum in the U.S., results showed that 86.66% of history standards are made in regards to pre-1900s Indigenous history and culture. These findings also showed that most standards depict Indigenous people as being stuck in the past. Currently in Minnesota, almost 80% of educators are white, and their preparation programs at colleges and universities are being taught by a majority white faculty with little exposure to other ways of knowing. Minnesota showed an alarmingly disproportionate number of only 1 teacher prep program out of 31 in the state that had a non-white majority faculty and administration. Implication of these new ed standards for Minnesota schools hold value for all students. In other states where ethnic studies curriculum has been implemented, studies show that students from all identity groups receive a positive academic impact, but not all ethnic studies courses will yield these positive outcomes. It is culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy courses that hold the promise of changing the educational landscape. Culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy requires educators to insert education into their students' cultures, allowing their students to see how their cultures are a source of knowledge and a resource. Given the current demographic of teachers in Minnesota who are now being required to implement Indigenous ways of knowing into K-12 curriculum, it's pertinent for us to find ways to support educators in building strong culturally responsive pedagogy and curriculum. In a survey of Minnesota educators, findings showed 66% did not feel a strong enough confidence in being able to incorporate Indigenous content into their curriculum. These educators identified that if they got connected to Native communities, their confidence would increase. To best prepare science educators to teach Indigenous knowledge, they must learn Indigenous pedagogy, and the Indigenous communities being learned about must be involved. The purpose of our teacher professional learning communities for Indigenous Science Project is to support science educators in learning about Indigenous science concepts in order to increase their efficacy to implement these concepts into curriculum in a culturally responsive way. Therefore, we established a year-long PLC using land and place-based education that centers Indigenous history and knowledge as valuable sites of struggle. Through this, we resist the Western settler archetype of Indigenous people being stuck in the past by demonstrating that Indigenous people and knowledge are here and will continue to be here. Our study recruited 10 public school science teachers from the same school district, and we utilized a qualitative design with the primary method being reflexivity interviews. And our data collection protocol included obtaining informed consent, the usage of interview questions, building relationships, and recording and transcribing 6 interviews. Data analysis protocol included an initial read-through of interview transcriptions, followed by a secondary read that developed initial codes, then a coding of all transcriptions by 2 coders, and an iterative feedback loop that included the entirety of the research team. 6 primary themes emerged after initial coding, which include learning journey or educators growing their own knowledge on Indigenous science, fear of insensitivity or educators' fear of teaching Indigenous knowledge incorrectly, issues in teacher prep programs or educator experiences on not having Indigenous knowledge during their teacher training education, issues in education or educator experiences on not being exposed to Indigenous history, science, culture, etc. as K-12 students, educator preparedness or teachers beginning to employ Indigenous knowledge and culturally responsive pedagogy in their classrooms, and pushing back on Eurocentric education, where educators expressing their wishes and actions to actively resist Eurocentric models of education. We also noticed the additional 10 additional sub-themes in our findings, but the data has not yet yielded substantial evidence at this point. Additional data throughout years 2 and 3 of the project may or may not strengthen these themes. Our findings imply that teacher prep programs need to change. Higher ed institutions must reform their teacher prep programs in response to the changing ed standards and shifting understanding of diversity and equity within education. Our findings also show the potential for an improved education experience among students who experience the highest disparities of education, but additional studies on student outcomes are needed. This project has brought vital perspectives and information on the impact of effective professional development on teacher efficacy. And through supporting MN educators by providing effective professional development, we begin to address the systemic harm and crisis marginalized youth experience and expose more students to ethnic studies and culturally responsive pedagogy. Additionally, through the collection of 6 interviews with science educators, the coding themes give voice to issues within the current state of K-12 education, thus establishing new possibilities for all educators and students in Minnesota. I'd like to thank the following parties: our project funders, the Institute on the Environment, and the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources, my faculty mentor, Dr. Katie Johnston-Goodstar, Drs. Hillary Barron and Seth Thompson, our other two PIs on the project, and the University of Minnesota's McNair Scholars team. Thank you.